The next Torah portion, the one we'll be talking about today, is called Lekha, which translated roughly means go to yourself or go for yourself. Lekha can mean any number of things regarding the second person pronoun, you. It is the way that God's prophetic message is heard by Abraham. As you remember from the last Torah portion, Noah, that portion ends with Abraham, his father, his siblings, the wives, everyone, starting on their way to Canaan, but they stop before arriving there. Then at the beginning of this portion, God tells Abraham, Lekha, go for yourself, go according to yourself, go for your benefit. In any event, Abraham takes that as the command to start going to Canaan. And he takes his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot. It's assumed that the rest of Abraham's family stays in Haran, which is in Mesopotamia. As part of this command to Abraham, which is, according to the text, the first time God speaks to Abraham, God will make Abraham into a great nation. There are a number of other promises made to Abraham at that time. One is that God will bless Abraham and his offspring. Another is that God will make Abraham's name great. Another is that Abraham will be a blessing. And that's unpacked a little more to mean that those who bless Abraham will be blessed, and those who curse him and his descendants will be cursed. At a certain point, Abraham and his entourage arrive in Canaan, and God promises the land of Canaan to Abraham and his descendants after him. It's hard to know exactly where the boundaries of that Canaan lie, but generally present-day Israel, and perhaps even further north and south. For example, all the way to the Nile perhaps, and maybe all the way to the Euphrates. In response to that promise, Abraham builds an altar and calls in the name of YHVH. It's hard to know exactly what that means. He calls in the name of YHVH. Perhaps he announces his relationship to YHVH. He invokes YHVH as his God, or he starts to teach in the name of YHVH. It's unclear. And also unclear is why God chooses Abraham. This is a big question that's never been exactly answered. All we know is that it happened, at least according to the text. So soon after Abraham and his family arrive in Canaan and told that that would be where he and his ancestors would inherit, a famine occurs, and Abraham and Sarah and Lot travel down to Egypt because there's food there. Because of Abraham's concern that Sarah's beauty will cause her to be abducted by the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, he asks her to tell them, the Egyptians, that he is her brother and she is his sister. This is because if they told the Egyptians that they were husband and wife, then they would kill Abraham in order to take Sarah. If they were siblings, which they seem to be half-siblings based on the genealogy, then the brother, Abraham, would be kept alive in order to, say, grant permission for Pharaoh to take Sarah as a wife. Because of this, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, is afflicted. And it's not specified what that affliction is, but he catches on it's because of Sarah being Abraham's wife. And Pharaoh scolds Abraham, who does not respond, and then sends off Abraham and Sarah and Lot. And as a result of their sojourn in Egypt, Abraham and Lot leave with a lot of possessions, camels and sheep and goats and servants and maidservants. They return to Canaan, and they split up, Lot and Abraham, because of conflicts between the shepherds of each person. They apparently have so many sheep and goats that they can't really graze together. So Abraham offers Lot wherever he wants to settle, and Lot settles in the plain of the Jordan, near the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which are quite lush. It's like the garden of YHVH, just like Egypt, which is irrigated by the Nile. There's an aside when describing Lot's move to the plain of the Jordan, the area of Sodom and Gomorrah, by saying that Sodom and Gomorrah are sinful, but the nature of their sin and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah takes place later. Once Lot separates from Abraham, God promises Abraham again that he will inherit the land and have numerous offspring. At that point, there's the narrative of the war of the kings, of the 4 kings versus the 5 kings. The 5 kings ruled over kingdoms that were paying tribute to 4 kings. And after a certain number of years, they rebelled against the 4 kings. The 4 kings then attacked the 5 kings and conquer them. And in the process of conquering, taking back the plain of the Jordan, they abscond with Lot. Abraham finds out, he marshals his men, they go after the 4 kings, defeat them, and retrieve Lot. Upon his return to Canaan, the king of Sodom comes out and wants to reward Abraham, but Abraham refuses. At the same time, the king of Shalem, Melchizedek, makes an appearance. Melchizedek is also called the priest of God Most High, which is one of the names of God. And he praises Abraham, praises God, and Abraham gives Melchizedek a tithe. The giving of the tithe is an indication that Melchizedek is actually a priest of God. The tithe goes to God by means of the priest. We return to Abraham not having any children with Sarah. And Abraham, at this point, is in his 80s. He leaves Haran up in Mesopotamia when he's 75, and he's in his 80s by now, with no children. And Sarah is, I think, 5 years younger, maybe 10 years younger than Abraham is. So Abraham asks God, how can I have children? We're both old. And then takes place the vision of the covenant between the parts. It's a very strange visual experience where God tells Abraham to take a number of animals, to cut them in pieces, to set them side by side. And then Abraham goes into a stupor, what's called tardema, which is a very, very, very deep sleep. It's the same sleep which God put the first man, Adam, into in order to remove the rib that ultimately turned into Eve, his wife. So God puts tardema upon Abraham this time as well, and Abraham has a vision of a fiery torch, a smoking torch going between the parts, a burning oven. There's a bird of prey comes down to try to eat the parts, and it's all quite psychedelic. So during this vision, God affirms to Abraham his covenant, the covenant of the land, the covenant of many offspring being a blessing, and so on. Also, at the same time, God foretells to Abraham the Egyptian bondage, that the Hebrews will be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. So once Abraham comes out of his prophetic trance, the story again returns to their having no children. So how can the promise of multiple descendants be manifest without any children? So Sarah has an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. Sarah tells Abraham to take Hagar as a concubine, and he impregnates her. And once Hagar becomes pregnant, she begins to lord it over Sarah. Sarah is upset, expels Hagar, who then flees to the wilderness, and an angel of God encounters her and tells her to return to Sarah and be afflicted by her, because the child who will be born will be a great nation as well. So Hagar bears a child, and the name of the child is Ishmael. which is God will hear. The translation will be God will hear. Yishma, God will hear. El. Yishmael. Yishma means will hear, and El is God. God will hear. Or pay attention to him, or hearken to him. So after the birth of Ishmael, God changes the name of Abraham and Sarah. Up until that point, their names are Abram and Sarai. And a hey, an H, is added to each of their names. So Abram becomes Abraham, Sarai, S-A-R-A-I, becomes Sarah, S-A-R-A-H. Sometimes when somebody becomes ill in Judaism, one of the options to recover is to change your name. So that may have something to do with the change of names of Abraham and of Sarah. So the symbolism, or the symbol of the covenant between Abraham and God on God's part, is the vision of the parts, the vision of the smoky torch and the burning kiln and the animal parts. That's the representation from God's side of his commitment to the covenant between Abraham and him, or Abraham and God. So what is Abraham's responsibility in the covenant? Well, the sign of the covenant will be circumcision, the removal of the foreskin from the male member, from the penis. And then God promises Abraham that after the circumcision of him and his household, then he will then have a child. Abraham laughs at the whole idea of him being in his 90s and Sarah being in her late 80s of having children. And the Hebrew word for laugh is the same root from which the name Isaac comes from. So God then tells Abraham that he will call the son that he has with Sarah Isaac, because of Abraham's laughing at the whole notion of having a child this late in the game. Despite this promise of the birth of Isaac, Abraham is fond of Ishmael. He's his firstborn son, and he loves him, and he loves Hagar. And Abraham pleads with God, well, can't Ishmael be my descendant? And as a result, God tells Abraham that he will make Ishmael great as well, but that the covenant will be kept with Isaac and his descendants. So at the age of 99, Abraham circumcises himself and the rest of his household, including Ishmael, who is said to be 13 years old at the time. And that's how this Torah portion ends. The next Torah portion, Vayera, begins with Abraham recuperating from the circumcision. Now, this is the most explicit and highly articulated description of prophetic experience in the text so far. There's a lot of conversation, lots of dialogue between Abraham and God. Abraham argues with God, please let Ishmael inherit me. There's visions for the first time, very psychedelic visions. This is the paradigmatic Hebrew Bible spiritual or religious experience called prophecy, and is communication between the divine and man. It is sometimes visual and sometimes simply verbal, but even in the visual experiences, there's a verbal cognitive message which is contained in the visions and then needs to be extracted. So what's the subjective experience like of prophetic consciousness? Well, it occurs in the mind. It's a subjective experience, but it's more real than real. Everything else drops off, becomes insignificant, and your attention is riveted. You're completely in the state, and you're interacting with some kind of presence, powerful, all-knowing, with will, sentience, has certain characteristics such as power and kindness, generosity, righteousness, and it can be negotiated with. It isn't a completely passive experience. But how do you know if the voice that you're hearing, the source of the visions that you're seeing, is just yourself or some outside force, outside presence? And you don't. There's no fail-safe, 100% sure way of determining that. But you do all you can to be a worthy vessel, and you do all you can to assess the nature of the information that you're receiving. The thing that's so unique about Abraham is that he really had no peer review available. There really wasn't any way for him to check in with anyone to see if what he was undergoing or experiencing was true prophecy or not. Maybe it was a demon talking to him, maybe it was just his own imagination, that he was making it up. So this is one of the things I love about Abraham, is that he was a true pioneer. There was no law, there's no Mosaic law. The life of Abraham takes place centuries before Moses and the laying down of the law. So Abraham was living a prophetic life, a completely inspired life without any external parameters to kind of constrain his behavior and his thoughts and his feelings. So he depended solely on prophetic consciousness to align himself with his internal and external worlds and the spiritual worlds as well. So that's the Torah portion, Lekha. I hope you like it. Please like it if you do, and subscribe to my channel. And see you for next week's Torah portion. Thank you.